Today we're going to be learning Moed Katan Daf Kaf Gimel. Today's daf is dedicated by Debbie Gvir and her husband Yessi in memory of Shimon ben Fegarezel and Chaim Aryeh, who passed away just as last Shabbat ended. My uncle Shimi was brilliant and talented with a strong love for Judaism, classical music, boating, and a great zest for life. He chose a different path than his Orthodox family, becoming a prominent Reform rabbi. He and his wife Judy, Shetibadei l'chaim arukim, always remained ever so respectful, loving, and close to his parents, sister, my mother, and Taz. I already miss you, Uncle Shimi, and will always treasure the time we spent together throughout my life. Today's daf is sponsored by Amy Goldstein in loving memory of her father, Melvin Sidney Goldstein, on his second yurtzeit. We miss him. He was taken from us too swiftly. May his neshama have an aliyah. Okay, I'm reminding everybody of the two upcoming events. One being the skills class that will be starting on Sunday on the topic of Tikkun Olam. Very recommended. I will be teaching it 4 weeks in a row on Sundays, so please join. And it'll be at 8:30 on Sunday, Israel time, 8 p.m. And the Siyum will be on Thursday. Siyum Moed Katan will be starting at Masechet Chagiga on Friday, our last Masechet of Seder Moed. Very exciting. Stay tuned for details of the Siyum Seder Moed. And the Siyum will be at Thursday at 7 p.m. Israel time. And there's a Siyum in Hebrew after at 8:30 for anyone who wants to join there. Okay, we will get started now from the bottom of Kaf Bet Amud Bet. Okay. Tanu Rabbanit. We're going to have a series of Brightot today. For the most part, our daf is made up of Brightot, giving us all different types of laws of mourning, as we've been learning until now. Chacham Shemet. Beit Midrasho Batel. I'm going to review where we ended yesterday. Sometimes at the end of the daf, we rush through things. So we're going to do a little more in depth. A Chacham dies. So what's the reaction of the community? Beit Midrasho Batel. So his own Beit Midrash where he taught, they all go to the funeral, but everybody else keeps going on as normal. Av Beit Din Shemet, if you have the head of a court who dies, Kol Batei Midrashot Shebe'iro B'Telim. He has a more prominent position. All the Batei Midrash in his town, in his city, don't stop learning. They go into the shul. When they go into the shul, they change locations of where they sit. We'll talk about this more. Well, eventually we'll get to what we do nowadays about this. Everybody changes their places. Those in the south sit in the north. Those in the north move to the south of the shul. And the idea being that you want to show there's upheaval, right? Things are not where they're supposed to be. So everybody changes places. Sometimes it also by changing places, right? You get very confident in your place. You think about people in shul and this is my spot, right? And people get angry when someone else takes their spot. And the whole issue of places, and there's a certain amount of stability in my place. This is my place. And sometimes not so much humility because, right, that's when we get into fights in shul and people say, hey, you took my spot. But this kind of puts you in your place and gives you, number one, it reminds you that you're not, right? The Av Beit Din just died. It kind of puts you in your place. That puts you in a place of humility and also that there's upheaval. Nasi Shemet, when you get to the level of a Nasi already, we're much higher. He has more authority over more people. So all the people under his authority, Batei Midrashot Kulam B'Telim, they all stop. Beit HaKnesset, Ubnei HaKnesset Nichnesim LeBeit HaKnesset, the people of the Knesset go into the Beit HaKnesset. It's not sure what the people of the Knesset are, but probably the people in the community who all gather. They go to the Beit Knesset. For what purpose? We're going to see right now. There's a few strange things about this. We seem to be talking about reading from the Torah. They read 7 aliyot, and then yotzim, and then they leave shul. Now, normally we don't read the Torah and walk out. We read the Torah. First of all, why are we talking about Shabbat? So it could be that we mean only on Shabbat do the people gather in the Beit HaKnesset. And only when they gather, it's only for Kriyat Torah, for reading the Torah, not for anything else. Yotzin, they leave, they don't, fascinating, they don't daven as a community in the shul. Okay, now, what's interesting about this is a few interesting things. Number one, why only mention Shabbat? So some people say it's only on Shabbat that they go to Beit Knesset, right? On a normal day, so you don't go for minyan because we're not going to shul for minyan. The whole minyan thing is canceled. And what about Mondays and Thursdays? So some people say, no, Mondays and Thursdays are not as important as Shabbat. Only for Shabbat Kriyat Torah do you go. Some people say, no, I was just using this as an example. And it means really anytime there's a communal Torah reading, you go to shul, but otherwise you don't. And even when you go to shul, you don't daven in a minyan, you just read the Torah. Now, why would this be that you read the Torah? Some people say because there's an obligation to read the Torah, but the obligation to read the Torah is actually not, it's more of a communal obligation. And it's more, if you have a community and you have a minyan, then you have an obligation to read from the Torah. So it's a little bit of a question why then we do this, why we create a situation where, right? But maybe they thought it was very important to read from the Torah, but other things not, right? You see here that minyan gets kind of thrown out the window. It's just in general, it's an interesting source. Rabbi Yoshua ben Korcha Omer, he's pointing out to us when it says yotzin, what he wants you to know is lo sheyilchu v'yitaylu b'shuk. It's not that you're going out to go partying in the shuk or doing your own regular things. No, it doesn't mean you leave shul and you go as life is normal. No, ela yoshvim v'domim. The point is we want you to be in your house, silent, not really being involved in any normal things. Basically, they're saying, right, the same way when we sit Shiva nowadays, generally people don't go to shul, right? Sometimes people do because they can't get a minyan in their house. But the idea is here, and then, by the way, some people think they do a minyan, they just don't do it in the shul. That again, this is an idea of kind of changing locations, that there's something that needs to be a little bit different than it was before. By the way, if it's only talking about Shabbat, then it's a little bit strange that Rabbi Yoshua ben Korcha says, don't go out into the shuk. What kind of shuk is there on Shabbat, right? Nobody's going to the shuk on Shabbat. So it could be a good indicator that this is talking about every day. It just brought this Shiva as an example of a day that one would read from the Torah. This we talked about the other day, and we're going to see this again, which is you can't learn. Okay, you don't bring shmu'ah, you don't bring agadah. Okay, shmu'ah is something somebody learned from someone else, right? Which sounds like it's not talking about in-depth learning. It's even simple learning. You don't do bebeit ha'avel. We have testimony about Rabbi Chananya ben Gamliel. He didn't keep this halacha. He did say a shmu'ah and an agadah and a beit avel. And the question is, right, there's a few things that come out of this. One is the issue of changing places in shul, which we're going to talk about a little bit more in the next source. So we'll put that issue aside in terms of getting to what we do nowadays. But the other issue is what we do nowadays, which is Avelim generally don't learn. And that's because we hold by the Tanna Kama here. We don't hold by Rabbi Chananya ben Gamliel, who did learn in the Beit Shiv'ah, the Beit Avel. However, we do know that there's this custom to, in between Mincha and Marav, usually they learn Mishnayot. So how can you learn Mishnayot if it says here very clearly, you can't say a shmu'ah and an agadah in the Beit Ha'avel, right? If you want to start distinguishing, well, in-depth learning, which kind of brings simcha rather than learning a simple Mishnah, which maybe doesn't bring that same element of simcha that we talked about a few days ago when we talked about learning and how learning brings happiness and a certain consolation, which we're not looking for this week of Avelut. Well, you could say that Mishnah doesn't do that, and therefore maybe you could do Mishnah. However, here it seems to say, even a shmu'ah, even agadah, all of that, you really can't learn. So it's hard to say that from here. Some people actually say that, that the shmu'ah and agadah and this whole thing relates to the beginning of the Braita, which is when the Nasi dies. And the shmu'ah and agadah that you can't do is specifically when the Nasi dies. But if it's a regular person, then actually you could. So that's an interesting way to read this, in which case, but then you have to get back to the other sources, which say you can't learn Torah, but then maybe you could say that Torah learning is different. That Torah learning is more in depth, and this is less in depth. That's a possibility. Another possibility is to basically say that, yes, you're not allowed to learn. However, there's, as always, that we've been discussing, there's conflicting interests here. Like right now, we just had Kriyat HaTorah. On the other hand, we don't really want people to congregate in the shul. Well, we're gonna say no minyan, but in the shul, but yes, you can do Kriyat HaTorah. So likewise, when it comes to learning, why do we learn in a Beit Avel? Because it's li'iloi nishmat. We want it to be a zchut for the person who died. Right? There's two people we're focusing on in this Shiva house. One is the person who died and the respect for that person. And the other is the mourners. So when it comes to the mourners, they're really not supposed to be learning, but we have this other issue that in order to respect the dead person, we want to learn l'zchutam, right, for merits for them. So therefore, we're kind of pulled. So we do this. It's short, it's simple, it's something for the mate, even though the mourners really aren't supposed to. I see somebody wrote that there's customs that sometimes the mourners leave the room when that happens. I also saw, by the way, In the Aruch HaShulchan, he talks about this, and he quotes that this, he quoted, let me see if I can pull it up here. I still have it open, 1 minute on the computer. It's not letting me open it, no. Oh, I know why I can't open it. Okay, anyway, he says that there's, he testifies basically that there's this Chevra Shas where they actually learn Gemara during Avelut because they're part of this Chevra Shas. I don't know exactly what exactly he was referring to, what exactly they learned, but that there's certain people that even learn Gemara during the Shiva. So obviously there's all different customs. In general, they say people can learn things that have to do with Hilchot Avelut. It came up this week, the question of, can people learn Moed Katan if we're doing the Daf Yomi now, right? Again, I'm not a posek and I'm not telling people what to do, but I do think that there's this issue. Learning Hilchot Avelut is not the same as learning Gemara Moed Katan as part of the Daf Yomi cycle. That's part of your, exactly what they're saying you're not supposed to do in Avelut, which is do your regular learning and Gemara learning. And that's different, I think, than learning Hilchot Avelut. So lots of, again, I'm not paskening. I'm sure there's different opinions about it, but I do think that if you think about the concept of it, I think the concept of it is no, that you wouldn't be learning this, even though it does have to do with Avelut. Okay, next. Tanu Rabbanan. Avel Shabbat Rishona eno yotze mipetach beito. Now we're going to have very interesting source. Again, we're bringing Brightot after Brightot here with different laws. This is, how do you gradually get back into the community? Okay, you basically separate yourself out. You stay in your house. You don't go out, right? People come to you. And how do you slowly, right? There's a progression here of how you, which makes perfect sense, right? It's very difficult for a mourner to get back into a regular shvung of life, right? You think about the people the morning after they get up from Shiva, like you don't even know what to do with yourself. And then you go on, people invite you to their house and you don't want to be going anywhere, and how do you slowly get yourself back in? So I don't know if this is the advice I would give you to take, but you see here that they're addressing exactly this issue. So we're going to have a machloket Tanakama and Rabbi Yehuda about this. Avel Shabbat Rishona. Shabbat Rishona doesn't mean Shabbat. Shabbat, many times we see in the Gemara, means Shavua, which means the first week. So the first week, Edo Yotze Mipetach Beito. We know this. When you're in Avel, you don't go out of your house. So the first week, you don't leave your house, right? Only for, right? Certain things you can leave your house, but generally you stay in your house, other than maybe most people go to shul on Shabbat. And, like I said, if there's no minyan, sometimes people leave for a minyan. There are situations where people can leave. In addition to that, anyway, Avel Shabbat Rishona eno yotze mipetach beito. Shnia, second week, yotze ve'eno yoshev b'mkomo. You go out and you can go to shul, for example, but you don't sit in your regular place. Okay, again, this idea of not sitting in your regular place. By the way, this applies, it seems, to anywhere where you have a regular spot, you should move your spot. I don't know if this means when you go to work, you should move your office. I think that would be quite difficult. But I think they mean a place where there's a lot of people gathering, like a Beit Midrash, for example, where also people have their regular spots. Okay, well, we're talking about a place where you could switch around, right? And as opposed to, let's say, your office where, it's very complicated. But you don't sit in your regular place. Shlishit, yoshev b'mkomo ve'eno medaber. And all of a sudden it got into my mind, what if you have like season tickets somewhere? Maybe you should switch seats with someone to a sports game. I don't think that's what they're referring to. I was just trying to think in my head, what else would you have mekomot kavua, Okay, shlishit, third week. Yoshev b'mkomo ve'eno medaber. You can go back to your regular seat. Now, if you're thinking we don't do that, hold off. We'll talk about what we do. Ve'eno medaber, but you don't speak to people. Now, notice in the previous one, it didn't say you don't speak. So on the second week, are you allowed to speak? Some people say, of course not. If you can't speak in the third week, you obviously can't speak in the second week. But, right, you're not supposed to, I guess it means like don't schmooze with people. And this, by the way, makes so much sense because when you're in Avel and you get involved in conversations and you just think like, why are they talking about such silly things, right? Your mind is somewhere else. And people are all like talking about, whatever it is. And you feel like this is not what I want to be discussing right now. So anyway, makes a lot of sense. Be silent, right? Don't socialize with people, basically. So some people say, obviously, in the second week, you don't socialize either. Some people say, no. Since you're not in your regular place, that's enough. You can talk to people, but because you're not in your regular place, again, not being in your regular place, by the way, in this case, well, Musaf and Nasi was a little different. In this case, part of the reason to not be in your place is for people to remember that you're in Avel and people to understand, right, and be sensitive to the fact, either they didn't know you were in Avel, and it's a way that they now know, oh, wow, I didn't know that you lost someone, or it's just to remind them, and maybe if you get back to this issue of conversation, remind you who you're speaking to and what they're going through and that they're not in the same place as you. So it serves as a very good reminder when you see someone not in their regular place, then it might remind you that they're in Ava. So some people say, since you're already in a different place, you can actually talk. It's only when you go back to your regular spot that you have to be careful not to talk. And some people say, no, if you can't talk in week 3, obviously you can't talk in week 2. Again, it's another good example of the Gemara didn't specify, and therefore it's open to interpretation, whether because it didn't say Eino Medaber in week 2, so we don't know what they meant. Rivi'it. By the 4th week, Hareu Kechol Adam. Everything goes back to normal. Okay, by week number 4, right? This is your gradual entry back into society. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, he basically, and you can see from the color-coded chart the way I did it, he basically pushes everything off a week. And he says, on what basis? He says, you don't need to say the first week the person doesn't go out of the house, because obviously the person doesn't go out of the house the first week. There's Shiva, and everybody comes to the mourner's house to visit them. So this whole idea that you said the first week they don't leave, that's already built into Shiva. So it must be, if there's a halacha about this, it must be for the second week. Right? He kind of says things that are so obvious don't need to be said, in which case it must be referring to something else. So he's basically going to move everything 1 week forward. So week number 2, Ela Shniya, Eino Yotzei Mepetach Beito, you still don't go out of the house. Shlishit, Yotzei ve'eino yoshev b'mkomo, the 3rd week you go out and you don't sit in your regular spot. Rivi'it yoshev b'mkomo ve'eino medaber, the 4th week you sit in your place and you don't speak. And chamishit hareu kechol adam, only on the 5th week you go back to being like everybody else. Okay, that was the next topic. Before we move on, I just want to talk about what we do nowadays. Nowadays, there's a custom, and I can't say everybody does this, but there is a custom that many people do, which is they don't sit in their regular seat in shul for an entire year. If it's for parents, 30 days if it's not for parents, and they don't do this anymore, what it says here. This is a good example. Until now, we've seen many, many cases that we keep saying, oh, the Rama says there, oh, we don't do this anymore, like the Atifat HaRosh, putting on the hair covering, and pulling your shirt off your shoulder, and all sorts of things we no longer do that are mentioned in the Gemara. Here's an example of something we do that's not mentioned in the Gemara. Right? So in place of all the customs that we no longer do, obviously other customs have developed. And it's a good indicator, and anyone who's sat Shiva probably already knows this, is that when it comes to mourning practices, there's such a wide range. And most of it is not, some of it is halachic, as we see. Many of it is just custom-based. And therefore, it's very, there's lots of wide range of different opinions about all sorts of things. So here's good examples of where, in general, we don't take everything from the Gemara, and we have things that aren't mentioned in the Gemara at all. Again, not to say that doesn't exist in other areas of halacha. Of course it does, but much more so here than in other places. Also, part of it is because there is no really avelut in the Torah. That was the whole thing, right? The only thing we have is this reference from, we have Nadav and Avihu. We have some references from David in the Nevi'im. We have some references from Eov, right? We've collected, and Yechezkel. We have references here and there, but there's no real dinei avelut in the Torah or in the prophets. Tanu Rabbanan. Okay, new bright. Now we get to the topic of when can you get married? Okay, can you get married during Shiva, Shloshim? What about if your wife dies? Okay, they don't talk about your husband. We'll talk about that also. But what if your wife dies, and how soon can you remarry? A very interesting question. We all know people who, it happens and someone gets remarried right away, and you look and say, that's really strange, right? But we're going to see the Gemara dealing with this and the issues that come up. So Tanu Rabbanan, the first thing is very general, not having to do with the spouse dying, but Kol Shloshim Yom L'Nisuin. After 30 days, you can already get married. You can't get married before. What's missing here? What about Erusin, engagement, which again, in those days, they did separately, right? Halachic Erusin, I don't mean like our kind of engagement, which doesn't have any halachic significance at all. But the Erusin that we now do under the chuppah, they would do before. So some people say, yeah, you can even get engaged right after the burial if you want. But others say no. In this case, Erusin goes along with Nisuin, and you have to wait 30 days, right? Because you're in a time of mourning, not appropriate to be getting married. Meta ishto, if it's your wife who dies, asur lisa isha acheret ad shi'avru alav shlosha regalim. You can't get remarried to another woman until 3 regalim have passed. Now, this is a strange answer. Now, we've seen this before with Baal Ta'acher, if you promise you're going to bring a neder to the temple. So how long do you have to bring it? And we saw different opinions, and they were somewhat based on the holiday cycles. That makes a little sense. It's talking about the holiday cycles because that was something that you would bring to the temple, and people normally went to the temple on the holidays. Why mourning has to do with, right? Why didn't you just say 6 months, 9 months, a year, something like that? Why do you say a cycle of holidays, which depending on what month you're in, cycle of holidays could be shorter, it could be longer. Also, what do we mean by holidays? Normally we say regalim, we mean the 3 regalim, Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot. Some people say it includes Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Shmini Atzeret is separate. So theoretically, if it was Tishrei, and they died before Tishrei, right, in the end of Elul, 3 regalim would pass in 1 month's time, right? So that's a bit of a strange opinion that you could actually count all those as holidays. So there's number one different opinions about what 3 regalim are. And also you're going to end up with different times. The one thing I thought that really could connect this. So first of all, why is this an issue that you need to wait? So Rashi in the Ketav Yad, the manuscript, which is on the side in smaller letters, not where Rashi normally appears, says, it shows basically that you don't really care that your wife died if you're getting remarried so quickly, right? It shows like, okay, move on, right? What did my first wife really mean to me? So that's a reason why, or second wife, we don't know what wife it is, but whatever wife it was. So it's kind of showing a lack of respect for her. So Shlosha Regalim could be, right? We all know that when you're in the first year of Eilut, the worst times are the holidays. And maybe that's the idea, that you've gone through a whole cycle of holidays and now you're ready to move on. Because the holidays are times where we feel this, the loss much stronger than on a normal day. So maybe there's a connection of the 3 regalim. It could be also just the rabbi's quoted time in holiday time, right? That was just their way of signifying time passing. Like a year for them was a year of holidays, even if it's not necessarily a calendar year. So that's another way of looking at it. Rabbi Yehuda disagrees. Rabbi Yehuda omer, regel rishon b'sheni asur, shlishi mutar. He thinks that 2 is enough, and the 3rd one already, it's fine. Okay, well, it's not clear why he does it, but he seems to think you need less time. Now, why is a woman different? So I want to point out a woman is different. First of all, it could be that this is also talking about a woman, but a woman has a separate issue. And I mean, you might say, well, even if you deal with that issue, but a woman, particularly, we're going to see some heterim that allow you to get married immediately. That would not be the case with a woman. And that's because a woman, there's always a concern that maybe she's pregnant. And because their belief was women either give birth after 7 months or 9 months, there's either 9-month pregnancies or 7-month pregnancies, which we've seen before. We'll see a lot more going forward, especially in Seder Nashim, which is that because of that, if she were to get remarried right away and get pregnant and have a child, 9 months later, then in 9 months from or before her first husband died. So we won't know, is it a 9-month baby for that one or a 7-month baby for the new husband? So there's always this concern. A woman always needs to wait 3 months after divorce or death before she can get remarried. Okay. So that's a very important halacha that is, underlying this. First of all, I think this would also be true likely for a woman, but there's additionally, again, this would matter because this is obviously after 3 months, unless you say it's all in 1 month and whatever, but a woman has some other issues she needs to grapple with as well, which are those issues, right? What about menopause and things like that? A menopausal woman, right? That's a separate question. I don't think the halacha distinguishes as far as I remember. I didn't check that out before. Maybe when we get to it next time, we'll look that up. Okay, now here come the heterim, which for sure would not apply to a woman because of this issue I just mentioned. Im ein lo banim, if he doesn't have sons, mutar li sala alter mishum bitul pilya livya. If he doesn't have children, then he can marry a woman immediately because it's so important to bring children into the world that this overrides the issue of the respect for his wife. Again, you have pulling, right? Things pulling at you in different directions. And hinicha lo banim ktanim, if she left him with small children, that's also an issue. Mutar li sala alter mipnei parnasatan. What's the issue? In those days, generally, men did not deal with young children. There's a whole thing about custody of children. It's a very interesting issue. We'll get to this much later about it, that in Jewish law, if you look just at the halacha, this is why if you go to a Beit Din, it's much harder for a woman to get child support when the kids are older. Kids are under 6, child support goes to the mother. Kids are over 6, childcare goes to the father, because then already he's responsible for their education. And the assumption is the husband's the one educating the children. So there's a whole interesting issue about that. Again, this is a topic we'll broach much more so when we get to it. So here you see this banim ktanim. It's clear that the father doesn't know how to deal with young children and he needs help with it. So mutar li sala alter, he can marry immediately mipnei parnasatan. It's interesting they use the word parnasatan. That usually means they need money to live on for sustenance. Now, what we mean here is not the financial aspect; it's the dealing with the children. And in fact, the Braita brings a maaseh, a case that happened. Shemeta ishto shel Yosef HaKohen, ve'amar. So his wife died. Yosef HaKohen's wife died. Ve'amar la'achota bebeit hakvarot, in the Beit HaKvarot. Okay, so you're asking. This is even during Shiva, even after Shiva, even during Shiva. It says here, in the Beit HaKvarot. He said to her, Lechi uparnasi et bnei achotech, go take care of your sister's children, which basically meant come into my house and be my wife. Okay, he says to the sister. Okay, and you're saying romantic, right? It's a little bit interesting. Ve'af al pichen lo ba'aleha ela lizman merubah. By the way, think about this. He does this in the Beit HaKvarot. Tomorrow we're going to see this sugya about, are we concerned for inappropriate behavior in a Beit HaKvarot, right? We're not really concerned that people are thinking about that in the Beit HaKvarot, but obviously there could be situation. Again, I don't think he was being so romantic about it, more so very practical. I need help, right? I need help with the children. Come marry me. But he didn't consummate the marriage. He didn't have relations with her until time passed. In other words, it wasn't a romantic relationship at that point. It was very practical. Only later did he fully consummate the marriage. My lisma merubah. The Gemara asked, now that we finished the Braita, what is this long period of time that he waited? Amar papa lachar shloshim yom. He waited 30 days. Tanu Rabbanan. Another issue about the shloshim here. Kol shloshim yom ligihutz. You cannot iron clothing or wear ironed clothing. Echad kelim chadashim. We're going to see a through and machloket about it. Echad kelim chadashim, echad kelim yishanim, yotzim mitoch hamachbesh. Even, right, old clothes, it doesn't matter. Anything that's yotzim mitachat hamachbesh, this was some sort of pressing tool that they used. They put like two boards together and that would kind of press the clothing. It's not exactly clear what this is, but some sort of thing they use for ironing. Any clothes that come from there, you're not allowed to wear, whether they were old or whether they were new. They look nice. Once you iron them, you're not allowed to wear them. At the same way, you're supposed to look kind of disheveled with your beard, again, for men, but and your long hair. So here also, you're supposed to look disheveled with your clothing and not wear the nicest clothing. Rabbi Yomi, lo asru ela kelim chadashim bilvad. Rebbe says only new clothing. Old clothing that you press doesn't look as nice. Rabbi Shimon Omer, lo asru ela kelim chadashim levanim bilvad. He limits it even more. He says new white clothing that's pressed is a problem. But if it's not white, even if it's new, you're allowed to wear it pressed. Now we're going to see two stories, people who held like different people in this Braita. Abaye nafik bigarda desar balaki Rebbe. Abaye went out wearing an old white garment like Rebbe. In other words, it wasn't an issue because it was old, even though it was white. Virava nafik b'chimutz tarumita, he went out with a Roman cloak. Sumakta chadate, it was red and it was new. So he obviously held Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon, who said only white is a problem. Next sugya. Now we're back to the Mishnah. The Mishnah had talked about the difference between Shabbat and the Regel. Shabbat counts as a day of the week, and it doesn't stop Shiva, whereas the Regel, holiday, is the opposite. Doesn't count as Shiva, like, for example, not like we hold nowadays, but in the days, according to the Mishnah, where you need a minimum of 3 days before the Regel in order to have it canceled. So if you only had 2 days, then the Regel wouldn't stop, right? Then the Regel stops the Shiva, but puts it on pause, and Eina Ola, and those days of the Regel don't count for days of Shiva, and you have to continue counting your Shiva after. So now we're going to see a difference of custom between the people in Judea and the people in the Galilee. B'nei Yehuda u'b'nei Galil. Hane Amre, moving now to Amud Bet. Yesh avelut b'Shabbat. These say, meaning we don't know who's what, but some of them held, in other words, either in the Judea or the Galilee. Yesh avelut b'Shabbat. We do avelut b'Shabbat. Most commentaries think that we're talking here about dvarim shebitzina, things that you do quietly in your house, privately. There's no public forms of avelut on Shabbat, but you do private avelut. It's also going to come up in tomorrow's daf more in detail. So let's assume even though there's a bit of a debate about it. The sugya is talking about, we're going to read the sugyas if it's talking only about things done in private. So some say, right, in one of these places, they say, yesh avelu b'Shabbat. You do things that are b'tzina. Like, for example, you're not supposed to have relations with your spouse. So you continually don't do that on Shabbat, or you're in your house. So you don't wear shoes on Shabbat, or, right, you might do all different things that are b'tzina, that are in your house that nobody else sees. We'll see tomorrow. Someone wore their torn garment in their house, right? You can't wear it out in public, but in your house you can. And others say, "Ein avelut b'Shabbat." There's no avelut b'Shabbat, not at all. Okay, it's as if it's a regular day. Manda amal yesh avelut b'Shabbat. So now, what's the proof? Each one's going to prove it from the wording in the Mishnah. Manda amal yesh avelut b'Shabbat. Why do you say yesh avelut b'Shabbat? De Katan ole. It says, or ola. It says, on Shabbat, those days count as days of Shiva. Well, why are they going to count if you're not doing anything that shows you're an Avel? So therefore, it must be you're actually doing certain things of Avelut, Yesh Avelut b'Shabbat, and that's why it counts as a day of Shiva. Otherwise, how could it possibly count as a day of Shiva? Mand amal, ein Avelut b'Shabbat, de Katane ein mafseket. If you say ein Avelut b'Shabbat, well, the proof is because it says it doesn't stop the Shiva. So now, why? How does this prove it? Well, isal kadatach yesh avelut b'Shabbat. If you thought there was avelut on Shabbat, hashta avelut naga ifsuke mibaya. If you say there is avelut on Shabbat, why would you even need to say that Shabbat doesn't cancel the Shiva? Shabbat would only theoretically cancel the Shiva if there was no avelut. So basically what they're saying is these words are absolutely unnecessary. Of course they wouldn't stop the Shiva because there's laws of avelut. So the fact that it says ein mafseket, and it's needed to say that, it must be ein avelut b'Shabbat, and yet it doesn't stop the Shiva. Okay, so that's each one's proof. Now we're going to have to figure out what does each one do with the other one's proof, right? How did they deal with that? Elaha katane ola, but it says it counts. So how could it count if it's not a day of Shiva? That's if you don't have any avelut on Shabbat. So they say, I did kabayla b'nesefa ein anolin. The language there is just because it said in the second part, in Yantif, it doesn't count. So here they're saying it counts, but not because you're doing Avelut necessarily. It's just that it does count as a day of Shiva. The one who says there is Avelut, Haktani enam of seket. Why do you need the language enam of seket? It's obvious enam of seket. If you're actually doing Dinei Avelut, so of course enam of seket. So why does it say it? Again, they're going to say, Mishum Tekabayim L'Miniseifa Mafsikim Tanareisha Enam Mafseket. It's all because of the second line, because of the holiday Enam is Mafseket. It stops the Shiva. Therefore, they want you to know on Shabbat, it doesn't stop it. It's obvious it doesn't stop the Shiva because you're doing Avelut, but they want to say it just to make, right, for a literary structure so that they have the differences between Shabbat and Avelut. Even though some might be obvious, they're just saying it because they're comparing the two. Now, the last part for today is to attempt to say that this debate between the Galileans and the Judeans is really a Tanaitic debate. And we're going to bring not laws of Avelut, but laws of Onen. We haven't really talked about this much, but an Onen is someone who, before they bury the dead, okay, before they bury their relative, you're in a status of Onen. And we're going to see here that the status is you don't do any mitzvot, really. Okay, and we'll see there's all sorts of laws that apply. And the main reason is because you're busy and you have to deal with burying the person. So therefore, you're busy with that. We basically exempt you from all commandments. And then you're going to see if it's Shabbat, well, that's all not going to be true because, well, the main reason is because you're not dealing with the burial on Shabbat because you can't. So since you're not dealing with the burial on Shabbat, so you can do mitzvah. And right now, the Gemara is going to assume what the basic structure is. I'll kind of give away the punchline. But the structure is that we're going to assume that what's true for an Onen is true for Shiva. In other words, if we're going to see this distinction, Yesh Avelut b'Shabbat, Ein Avelut b'Shabbat, we're going to see also in Onen, there's a machloket about it. We're going to assume the same applies for Shiva, to which the Gemara says, no, Onen is a totally different thing. Can't learn, which makes a lot of sense to say that. But the original, right, the beginning part, when they suggest, maybe it's machloket tanaim, they kind of assume that they're very similar, even though they're really not. Because again, mourners, the laws of mourning are all about, because you're mourning, When you're in onin, it's not because you're mourning, it's because you're having to deal with the burial details, etc. And also maybe like the initial shock of everything and all that. So lema kitanai. So now they say, let us suggest that this machloket is machloket tanaim, whether there's avelut b'Shabbat in private or there isn't. Misha meto mutal lefanav. If the dead body is right there with you. Now, this generally doesn't happen either, right? Where the body's in your house. Okay, maybe sometimes happens, but not so often. Ochel b'bayit acher. You can't eat in your house if the body is there. Ein lo bayit acher. What if you don't have a second house? Most people don't have a second house. So ochel b'beit chavero. You eat in your friend's house. Okay, now, I forgot to mention this. This comes up in Masechet Smachot. Okay, Masechet Smachot is there's a bunch of these small Masechtot. Okay, some of them are assumed to be Tanaitic sources like this one, and Avel Rabbati and things like that. But some of them are known to be later, or at least possibly from the time of the Geonim. Okay, there's a bunch of these small Masechtot. Okay, so this is one of them. It's called Masechet Smachot, even though it deals with Avelut. It's one of those, euphemisms again. Okay, so if you don't have another house, you eat in someone else's house. Okay, you don't have two houses, so you eat somewhere else. If you don't have a friend's house, then what do? You make a mechitza 10 tfachim high. This reminds us of Sukkah, it reminds us of Eruvin, all those things where we talked about the height of a wall, right? A basic minimum height is 10 tfachim. Make a separation, a barrier between you and the dead body, then you can eat. What if you have nothing and you have no other house to eat in? You have no friends that you can go to. You don't have a second house. You don't have anything to build a wall with. You turn your head away and your back is to the dead body and you eat like that. Okay, that part wasn't so connected to our sugya, but now we start getting to all sorts of things. You don't recline when you eat. This reminds us of Pesach, right? People reclined. It was very common to recline in those days when you ate. No reclining. You can't eat meat. You can't drink wine. You don't make any blessings. You don't make a zimun when you eat. You don't, nothing. You can't have someone else make your bracha for you or do the zimun for you and you answer. No, nothing. You're exempt from Shema. You're exempt from Amidah, right? From Shmona Esrei. You're exempt from wearing tefillin. You're exempt from all mitzvot it says in the Torah. This is in addition, by the way, to the tefillin you don't wear on day number 1. Shabbat. On Shabbat, though, what do? None of this applies. Meseva ochel, you recline and eat. Ochel basar, shotei yain, you eat meat, you drink wine. Mivarechu mizamen, you make the blessings before, you make the blessings after. Mivarchinu mizamnim alav, you can join a zimun, people can do the zimun for you, people can make a bracha for you. V'chayav b'kriyat shema, u'b'tfilah, u'b'tfilin, you're chayav in shema, you're chayav in tfilah, you're chayav in tfilin. That's very weird. What do you mean you're chayav in tfilin? Nobody wears tefillin on Shabbos. So many people think that this word is here by accident because of the first part. It said tefillin, you don't wear tefillin. So in this part, when we talk about Shabbat, it accidentally added the word tefillin and it really doesn't belong in some of the manuscripts. The word is not there, which makes a lot more sense. And then you're obligated in all mitzvot in the Torah. Rabban Gamliel Omer, mitoch shenitchayev be'elu, nitchayev be'kulan. He says, since you're obligated in these, you're obligated in all the others. Now, what's the difference between Rabban Gamliel and Tanakama? They seem to be saying the same thing. He says, tashmish hamita, having sexual relations with one's spouse, is the one that's the nafkamina. Why? Okay, there's a mitzvah to have relations with your wife when it's her time, ona, okay, it's a mitzvah of ona when she wants it, all different issues. We'll get to this more in depth another time. But the idea being is that when it's that time, you have a mitzvah, okay, to have relations with her. So when we say nitchayev, when Rabban Gamliel says nitchayev bekulan, he means even mitzvah ona, even though it comes in conflict with this idea of tashmish hamita, which is abelut b'tzina, right? It's private, and theoretically you should be doing it on Shabbat. But he comes and says, no, the mitzvah of ona overrides this, okay? And therefore he says, right? So my la baka miflage, is that not their machloket? Demar savar yesh abelut b'Shabbat, umar savar ein abelut b'Shabbat. If you basically hold that there's no issue of Tashmish Mita, in other words, you're allowed to do it because Ein Avilut B'Shabbat, even B'Tzina, that means you're allowed to have relations on Shabbat, then that's Rabban Gamliel who says you're basically obligated in everything, even if it conflicts with this issue, because it doesn't conflict, because there's no issue. So he must hold Ein Avilut B'Shabbat. And Tanakama must hold Yesh Avilut B'Shabbat, and that's why he doesn't include Tashmish Mita. And it doesn't say it explicitly in the machloket between them that's it, but that's the way Rabbi Yochanan understood the machloket. So now that's our assumption. That's how we basically come up with. Maybe this is a machloket Tanaim. Rabban Gamliel holds Ein Avilut B'Shabbat, and Tanakama holds there is Avilut B'Shabbat, and that's why Tashmish Mita is not permitted. Comes the Gemara and says, no, you're comparing apples and oranges. As I told you before, you're comparing an onen to someone in Shiva. Those are two very different things. And now we're going to see from each one's perspective, Tanakama and Rabban Gamliel, why they would say differently in the other case. Mimai. So we have to look from the lens of each one separately. Dilma ad kan lo kamer Tanakama hatan. Maybe Tanakama only said this in onen. Ela mishum de meto mutal lefanav. Maybe he doesn't allow you to have relations with your spouse because the dead body is in the house. That's very inappropriate. Just like you can't eat and recline, you shouldn't be having relations with your wife. Not having to do with morning practices on Shabbat. It's just not appropriate. But once the dead body is buried and your relative is no longer in your house, so then already maybe Tashmish Mita on Shabbat would be okay. Even right. And then maybe even Tanakama holds there is Avelut. There is not Avelut on Shabbat. Okay, and you'd be allowed to. And maybe Rabban Gamliel, who there permits it in onen, maybe wouldn't permit it in Avelut. Why? You would say, you're not even, there's no, who says Tashmish Mita is forbidden when you're in onen? Onen is you can't do all these mitzvot because you're busy and you're dealing with the dead body. But maybe maybe Tashmish Mita isn't forbidden yet, right? All the things that are forbidden to do are forbidden in Avelut when you're sitting Shiva, not when you're in onen. But once Avelut kicks in, it could be on Shabbat also, you can't do it. And he was only talking about onen where he permitted it. Maybe he wouldn't permit it on Shabbat within the week of Avelut, because maybe he would think there is Avelut B'Tzina. Okay, this topic of Shabbat and Avelut is going to continue into tomorrow's daf, so we'll see more about it there. Have a Shabbat Shalom, everyone, and we will pick up. So again, tomorrow's daf will be more about Avelut on Shabbat. Is there Avelut? Isn't there Avelut? Which they're going to get much more specific into which types of things of Avelut are there or not. Have a great day. Have a great Shabbat as well, and see you on Sunday.